Hi, welcome to my studio. If you've been following our dialogue the last few visits, we've been talking about the process and the concept of painting. And so this is kind of continuing that dialogue. Today I want to talk about basically there's two ways to approach painting. And it's very general, but it's called plein painting or direct painting. And the terms kind of sound like what they are. Plein painting is a plein painting. The media a lot of times will dictate whether you do plein painting or direct painting. Direct painting is you just start applying paint. And so what are the differences and why do we approach it that way? So that's what we're going to talk about today. So plein painting, media driven, an example would be egg tempera. Egg tempera is a very demanding, tight media that requires a lot of pre-planning. Usually, artists will do a complete chiaroscuro drawing, which means a rendered drawing, and fill that in kind of like a paint by number, if you will. And the strokes are very tight and contained because the media dries so quickly. And so, that requires a lot of planning. Watercolor is another media that requires a lot of planning. Usually in watercolor, because the paints are transparent or translucent, the white of the paper is what creates the highlights and the white of the object painted or the subject. And so there's usually preliminary drawings done on the paper or masking or all kinds of things. So these kinds of, you have to plan with the media. Frescoes, I love frescoes. Mural painting, the paintings that Michelangelo did and the artists in the Renaissance, that really had to be planned because they were painting in wet plaster and they could only do as much as the wet plaster could. So they would do a day's work where the plaster would paint and they would dry. So the media, fresco, requires full-scale drawings usually for the artist to actually do it, which were called cartoons, to draw into the plaster and actually fill in the painting. Then we have acrylic and oil, which are in my mind more forgiving because they're more malleable. They handle differently, and they really lend themselves to direct painting. And so the media that you use is going to dictate to a point whether you're doing a plein painting or direct painting. The subject matter, if you're doing a portrait requires drawing skill. If you're going to do an identifiable portrait, everything has to be in the right place to make it that person. And so a portrait is usually drawn on the canvas, or if the person does it out of print and paints it on the canvas, they have very good drawing skills. So the direct painting lends itself more to an application and a response that is immediate. And the Impressionists are a great example of painters who did direct painting. Today, direct painting, I would say, is probably the go-to way. Plein air painters, they go out and paint the landscape. Usually there's very little preliminary work. Myself, I do direct painting. And so today we're going to talk more about direct painting than plein painting because that's more my forte. The painting behind me is about an hour and a half work. It's what I would call a block-in. When you do a direct painting, generally in oil, I like oil because I like the way that it handles. I like the texture and the malleability and the gestural quality of oil paint. I've tried acrylic. The problem for me with acrylic is it dries too quick. Especially if you're doing plein air. If you're outside painting, literally you're fighting the paint drying all the time before you're ready for it to dry. Oil painting can have a tendency to dry a little slower, but I use it to my benefit. What I do anymore is I do a block-in, stop, let the painting set overnight. I use mediums that are alkyds that dry overnight usually. Then the painting's dry the next day and I can go into it fresh. So the block-in is a block-in. What you're trying to establish is the lightest light and the darkest dark. whether it's an abstract or representational. These are the things that create balance and composition and rhythms in your painting. And so squinting, this is a secret that I learned 50 years ago at the Kansas City Art Institute. If you want to see value contrast, squint. Squint at your painting and you can see your value contrast. Squint at the thing you're painting and you can see the highest highlights and the darkest darks. It's an excellent tool to see value contrast. However, realize when you're squinting, it takes things down a little bit. So when you're squinting down, the darks are just a little darker and the highlights aren't quite as light. But you do see the relationships. For example, when you look at this painting, when I squint down, my darks are in this area here and this area here. And that creates a nice movement. And these are things that you need to think about. So when you're blocking, that's what you're trying to establish. When I started this painting, I use a piece of vine charcoal, and the first thing I do is I say, okay, where's my horizon line? And I take my vine charcoal and I lay in my horizon line. And then if I've got some elements of composition, diagonals. Diagonals are wonderful movement pieces. So maybe I'll lay in a mark for the diagonal. And what I generally do is just make 3 or 4 marks. Maybe a tree that's prominent or leads to something. So I make these marks. That's all of the drawing I do on the canvas. And then I start to lay in my color. And the secret is, this isn't arbitrary. This is important. You want to do the best, most accurate value and color and placement that you can, because if you're not, don't want to see a painting as a series of corrections. You want to see a painting as something that evolves. And so if you start off sloppy, you're going to wind up sloppy. If you start off accurate but loose, you're going to wind up more accurate. You're going to wind up more resolved to what you want to get. And so in this painting, I laid in my darks. And if you get the color right, you've got the value right. And so if I get that right color green, if it's the right green, it's also the right value. You can get the right value in the wrong color, but that's a whole other story. So you really want to try to get the colors correct. And so you want to block these in a very general way, and then you want to start to work your contrast, your darks and your lights. Play the strongest lights against the strongest darks, and you just build from there. This painting is done, it's called Horse Creek, and it's about 7 miles from where we live. And I visited it numerous times, but this is a conceptual painting. This is out of my mind, memory. And so I have some power there to move things, which, you know, I'm making a painting, so I want to make it more interesting. Hopefully this becomes a painting that represents Horse Creek, but it also represents my response to Horse Creek. So anyway, in direct painting, this method is probably the prominent method today. I think oil painting is probably the best media for it. Acrylic works, but for me, you know, it's a personal taste. Your style is going to dictate to a point how you handle direct painting or plein painting. If you are very representational and really tight and, you know, photorealistic, if you really want that quality, you're going to do more plein painting. If you ride more spontaneously and more responsive, then you're going to be, you know, to things around you or whatever, you're going to be probably more, you're going to lean more towards direct painting. One isn't better than the other. They just facilitate what you want to accomplish. But think about when the next time you approach your painting, do you want to approach it as a direct painting or as a plein painting? You know, your personality in paint. Don't worry about your style, because your style is you. It comes out. If you're true to you, then your style will evolve. Don't look at other artists. Don't worry about other artists. Worry about yourself. Have a good day and keep painting.